Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast. We'd like to welcome our viewers and listeners again for another weekly interlude of intellectual pontification. I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Dave Peltz, and our other co-host is Dr. Joe Hamlett. How are you doing today, Joe?
I'm doing fine, but I don't know. You might have scared some of our audience away with, using those big words. So,
That sometimes I think that's all I got out of my college education was the
okay,
ability to use a dictionary and thesaurus.
okay, all right. Well, at least you got something out of
You got
it.
something out of it. So, this week's topic is resilience, and quite an interesting topic when you think about it, when you ponder resilience. One of the funny things that we noticed before we started this episode was that when you spell resilience, if you take away the first or the second I, it actually says resilience, which is kind of weird, but that's our language for you. So, Dr. Joe, what are your thoughts on resilience?
Dave, you got this. We're started off on a rocky road right now. So let me try and reel us back
Oh,
in.
right. Sounds good.
All right. So resilience, most of us, for the most part, we experience um, things we need to overcome, things that we need to bounce back from, and some of us do it better than others. So resilience is just that ability to come back or recoup or bounce back or be able to move forward, maybe past some difficulty in your life, in your career, just something that caused you to have to take a pause and to regroup and then come back stronger. And so, I had this conversation, or not really a conversation in reference to resilience, but I had a colleague of mine. I might have told this story before, but I had a colleague of mine years ago, come to me and say, hey, he needed some assistance with, moving forward in his career. And, he came to me mainly because for one, he had been in this position for a lot of years. So he hadn't faced anything where he needed to have the resilience to rebound from or return from. So he had been status quo for all these years. And now he was put in a position where he had to do something different. And it was a challenge for him because he didn't think he had, the ability to be resilient or to
Mm,
bounce back because he had never been put in that situation. And so when he approached me, he said, I wanted to ask you how you do it because you had to do it so many times. And so I'd like to introduce another piece of that resilience. And in my eyes, I see it as forced resilience because
interesting.
I
Interesting.
had to, overcome multiple times. He was absolutely correct. I'm talking in reference to my job, my career. I have, been in companies where they've completely closed the doors, basically said, hey, you're going to have to leave. We're no longer in existence. And that
Mm,
particular location is a parking lot now. So that's
wow.
how bad that transition was, or me having that ability. So that caused me to move from California to Missouri.
Mm.
And then I also work for companies that laid you off all the time. Every year you could expect layoffs.
Yeah, there are some
Then
companies that operate that lean.
Absolutely. And then there's another, time when I was laid off because the company moved their operations to another state.
Mm,
And so every time that occurred for me and my family, we had to be resilient enough to move on and start all over again. And so he was absolutely correct. I had been in a position more than I'd like to admit, but at the same time, it built that resilience or that ability to bounce back. It's not a pleasant thing, but he was right. I had been in a position where I could view it as, okay, here's an obstacle, here's a barrier, here's a roadblock. Now we have to figure out how to get over it, around it, through it, between it, whatever it takes.
mm.
And so we did. Again, the wife and I, the family, we did learn how to bounce back, and not to say that it's easy, but again, you get to that position where and I've said this before in episodes, you become that victim or victor.
Hmm.
And you become that victor by, again, taking a little bit of time to reflect on what's just happened, but then having that ability to move forward, take that and not just wallow in it, or, have that self-pity, woe is me,
Hmm.
but to get to a position where you can move forward
Yeah,
effectively.
Joe, you said several interesting things that I want to touch on, or at least a couple of them as I remember them. You mentioned your career, and then you mentioned, kind of or alluded to resilience as we grow, and
Right.
and a lot of us can relate to resilience when we think about small children being very resilient to overcome
Right.
uh,
Right.
events in their lives. They're very resilient. They're remarkable. It's a remarkable time in our development that most of us don't remember.
Right.
We recall the stories that our parents told us about being resilient, but the actual events themselves, maybe not so much. And I can relate to that to some degree. My family moved around quite a bit when I was younger. Um, Primarily, my dad was an electrician, so he had to go where the work was. So it meant,
Right. Right.
he couldn't drive an hour and a half to a job, so we'd move. So we moved a lot. I think between when I first started kindergarten to graduating high school, we moved like a dozen times or something. I've been to a dozen
Wow.
different schools. So
Right.
when we talk about resilience, the part that comes to my mind is the willingness to adapt and take the situation for what it is. And when I was younger, granted, I didn't look at it as a learning experience. I looked at it as more of a survival technique, where it's like, hey, we got it, we're moving, we're going to pack up and go to a new school, and wash, rinse, and repeat type thing. And you get, I don't want to say you get used to it or comfortable with it, but you learn to expect certain things when
Right.
you become resilient. And then when we fast forward into our careers, military careers, we move around a lot, and and you get used to starting over sometimes. And,
Right.
some
Right.
people are better at it than others, but when you mentioned resilience and forced resilience, those were some of the things that came to my mind. When you're in the military, or when you're growing, well, back up, when you're growing up and your parents move, before you're an adult or considered an adult, you really don't have much of a choice. You're forced to be
Right.
resilient
Right.
and go where your family goes. And then in the military, they kind of teach that to you, but they don't really describe it that way. They just say, oh, you're going to be going to your next base in 6 months or a year or
Right.
3 years or
Right.
whatever. And you're forced to start over. And I think that when we talk about forced resilience, those are some of the things that come to my mind, or like in the event of layoffs. And again, for our viewers and listeners who can't see us, and you're just listening to us, which is awesome, we appreciate it. Joe and I could be twins, but we're not twins. So our lives are, it's uncanny how similar they are. Joe mentioned about being laid off twice, and I've been laid off twice, and it alludes to that, or is a direct example of being resilient and being either a victim or a victor. You can fall into the and wallow in self-pity and say, oh, it's me, it's, what did I do, poor me, poor me. But or you can do that for a few moments, and then change your perspective a little bit and say, okay, now what do I need to do to get through this and move on to the next piece of my life,
So,
or the next
so,
stage or
so
step.
Dave, you brought up, I think, one key point that, and I think that's one of the topics we talked about or touched on, or considered. What was
Mm-hmm.
that survivor mode? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that is really what you go into, because you start to think about, you don't have time for self pity and all that when you start thinking. In my case, I had, a wife and 3 kids,
Mm-hmm.
and I was the sole breadwinner, so I couldn't just sit back and say, "Well, it'll get done when it gets done." No, I had to think about, my kids' future, my wife. How am I going to take care of them? So it
Mm-hmm.
instantly goes into, I have to do what I have to do to
Yeah.
take care of them. And in one case, I had to go out of town. You said your dad chased, had to chase the job sometimes. I
Mm-hmm.
actually did that too. I went out of
Yeah.
state and left the family home,
Yeah.
just so that I could continue to, make sure they were supported and taken care of. But I'll just kind of correct you a little bit.
Okay.
So I've been laid off more than twice. I've been
Okay,
laid off
so
about
well, then we're
four
not
or
really
five
twins anymore.
times. No, not at all. So,
Wow.
so, and yeah, so like I said, the first one was, the company shut down. The second was just being laid off multiple times at a company. Then the third was the company actually closed the doors and moved on. And then the
Mm.
fourth one was, again, they came and said, "Hey, we're laying off this number of people. You're laid off." So it was four times for me.
And,
And
and I'm going to interject, and I find that interesting. Not that you've been laid off 4 times, but there's a. I'm seeing that type of situation doesn't have to necessarily result the situation being resilient is not necessarily being laid off, although that is a wonderful example. But for those that have not been laid off but have been had to partake involuntarily into restructuring of
right,
companies,
right, yeah,
that's the same, that can be result in the same sort of resilience when you're told, hey, by the way, your team's going away, you need to find another job in let's say a week or two,
right,
either within
right,
the company or without, we don't care. That's kind of puts you in that same mode of survival. You have a paycheck for a few more weeks before you're let go, and you're looking at that internal opportunity because typically that's the comfort zone, especially if you have any time with that company and you enjoy working there. And so I think many people, for those that have not been laid off or laid off multiple times, maybe that's another good example of those forced restructurings and putting us in that resilience mode or that survival mode of, holy cow, I got to find another team or another department or another area within the company so I don't lose my job. And
right,
sometimes we're successful at that, and sometimes the clock runs out, and then we're in that uncomfortable situation of being laid off or let go and looking for work. So,
right.
um, what about some different perspectives or situations or scenarios? So we've talked about work a little bit, being laid off or let go and being resilient. Um, what about opportunities when people are promoted and take on new responsibilities? I know a couple of times when I've been promoted, I'm like, "Yay, I'm promoted! Woohoo! I'm all excited." And then I'm like, "Wow, this is a lot more than I had expected. I just jumped into the deep end of the pool." It's
Right,
like,
right.
so that resilience is really pressing through that uncomfortableness in that new position to ensure your success so you don't flounder and fail. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good point because oftentimes we think of resilience as because something happened to us, and we have to have that ability to bounce back, move forward, realign, and all those types of things. But you're absolutely correct. That resilience could also be because you were promoted, like you said, or you put on a different team, and you were comfortable with where you were, and now you're in this new environment. Like you said, you're happy for a short period of time because, oh, you got the promotion, you got more money,
You got
but
the
then
new
at the same
team, you got the
time,
new whatever. Yeah.
well, now you got the new responsibilities too,
Yep.
responsibilities that you didn't have before. So how do you prepare yourself or get yourself in that mode of, okay, now, this could be detrimental if I don't come up to speed or if I don't get, on the right page fast enough. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a good point because, like you said, I hadn't really considered that as being resilient too, but that's all part of it is that ability to, react to whatever situation and be able to come out stronger for it or be able to address it. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you don't come out stronger for it. And in some cases, you may get that promotion and realize that it is too much. It
Mm-hmm.
is overwhelming. And you may step back. You may say, hey, I thought I was ready, but I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
But then that also gives you that chance to go build, go develop, and build that resiliency, and be able to come back stronger for it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I think we can almost call that self-imposed resilience,
right, yeah,
because we've made that choice versus forced resilience. It's self-imposed resilience, versus
right,
just resilience in general, which is, to me, you know, something, you get a flat tire and you have to be resilient to get that tire changed or that
right,
car taken care of to get to your appointment on time. You have to push through these uncomfortable situations,
right.
be it positive or negative, be it imposed or self-imposed or forced or not forced. I mean, it's really a fascinating subject when we start peeling those layers back to understand the different perspectives and impacts of resilience and how they can be brought to you, or how you can put yourself into those situations, either advertently or inadvertently. We can
Right.
think that the grass is greener on the other side, and we leave one company and jump in and realize, holy cow, what did I just get myself into?
Right.
And now what's that resilience look like? Is it self-imposed? It's definitely not forced, because we made that choice to go there, but it was with
Right.
the perspective and the understanding it was a good move. And now we just put ourselves into a situation that may not have been, that may be equally as uncomfortable or not, or far worse than we were originally in. And then
Right.
conversely, sometimes we have to make that move to, we don't have those opportunities within the company, so we seek them outside, and it winds up being a wonderful, wonderful situation, serendipitous, if you will. It's like, well, we're have to let you go, and next thing you know, it's maybe a few weeks or a few months down the road, and you realize, wow, that really changed my life for the better. I had a client many years ago, and I was talking with their staff, and the individual told me he worked for a company, and he had been there, I think 5 or 6 years, and he thought he was doing well. And the manager talked to them and said, hey, unfortunately, and I'm paraphrasing and shrinking the
Right.
situation down.
Right.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to let you go. And, this person had a family and was just beside themselves. What do I do? What do I do? And within 3 or 4 months, they had a position with another company, a better position, almost double the pay.
Wow.
So being resilient and a much happier person and environment in that situation, because of that forced resilience that had been imposed upon that individual. So sometimes things are not as bad as they seem when we clear our minds after the initial shock and awe of the situation, whether it's good or bad. I mean, because you can have shock and awe for a good situation too.
Right. Right.
Like, oh, I got my promotion, I got all this responsibility. It's like, wait, what? I have to work how many hours a day, a week, and days? What? No time off?
Right. Now, you brought up a good point earlier in the conversation about learning that resilience as a kid, and we didn't move as much as you did, but
Mhm.
we moved again as a family. Growing up, we moved. I went to different schools. Even
Mhm.
before graduating high school, we moved after my sophomore year and the start of my junior year to a different state. And then I started high school there. So
Mhm.
yeah, you're right. You are building that resilience. You're building that ability to do that as you're going through those situations. So you're right. Those people that may not have experienced that, it may have had it like I was referring to my friend or colleague who had a great life, or things had not been disruptive enough to make him have to change directions or anything like that. So a lot of times that resilience is built in, and sometimes your parents help you without even knowing it, because that's
Mhm.
what you deal with. And even with my kids, when we moved from California, they were old enough to know that they had just moved from California, but when presented with that situation again to move to another state, I chose not to, and that was
Mhm.
one of the reasons why I chose to move out of state, because my kids had already moved a couple times. And although, like you say, it can help you grow and help you be prepared for that, but at the same time, I didn't want my kids to experience
Right,
that
right.
that
Maybe not that to that frequency or
to that degree.
intensity. Yeah, that intensity.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And so that was the choice that my wife and I made, to again have them have as normal of a childhood as they could,
Right.
uh, even with the circumstance of just being displaced so many times.
Hmm.
And you ask them today, they'll say, I don't know how you did it or how we did it, with all those disruptions in our lives. And
Hmm.
so that's a good thing that, they didn't have to see the stress and all the, didn't feel that. So I think if they were put in a situation, then they would be able to respond positively because they have experienced it a little bit. But for those people that have not done it, I think that that could be a challenge to them. But I think
Hmm.
you brought up a good point too, is that perspective, looking at it positively, even with a
Yeah.
job, a new
Seeking that silver
promotion.
lining.
Absolutely. It may become now more responsibility. And I have to do more, I have to work more. But what's the end result? What am
Yeah.
I trying to gain from this? And again, that may come back to the point that this is more than I wanted.
Hmm.
But that's still resilience, because
Yeah.
you realize within yourself, hey, this is not the path I want to go down. This
Yeah.
is not the experience I wanted to have. So I choose, like you said, is it directed, non-directed? You
Hmm.
direct it yourself. That's still just your choice, your
Hmm.
decision. That you can say, hey, no, this is not what I thought it was going to be. But
Yeah.
again, that's still your choice.
And I like where you how you've brought this to the forefront, this topic, and some of the underlying themes. And I think a couple of those fall into motivation, whether it's internal
Yep.
or external motivation, or whether you have an internal locus of control, meaning that you have that drive to guide yourself and your career through the situations, versus an external locus of control, which is kind of like what happened when our parents moved us. We couldn't control where we were moving,
Right.
but
Right.
we could control how we dealt with the situation. So the external locus of control is, hey, my parents moved me, or the military moved me, or I got laid off from the company. The internal locus of control is, hey, I'm going to adapt and overcome in what regardless of the situation. I will survive, I will make it, I have to make it, and these are the things I'm going to do to get to that point.
Right.
So I like where how you really broke it down into terms that everyone can relate to. And here's me bringing in all these big words again.
No, that's a good point. That again, it comes down to still that ability to, address it the way you feel necessary or need, and
Mm-hmm.
that's again part of that resilience, being able to adapt to it based on however it happened. Like you said, whether it's external, and your parents are the ones who moved you around, but you still have the choice to determine how you're going to
Mm-hmm.
face it, how you're going to address it, how it's going to impact you. You still have that control.
Yeah.
Um,
And I like
so
what you just said. You have that choice. Maybe that's a topic for another episode. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. How we respond is up to us. And granted, sometimes we, people are invariably going to encounter uncomfortable and unfortunate situations. But what do
right,
we do to get through them and overcome them, if we even can? Sometimes it's just completely out of our control, and it is what it
right,
is. But oftentimes there are some things that we can do, big or small, that can have the biggest impact, and we don't even realize it until we make those decisions to be resilient and to keep pressing forward regardless of what's thrown at us. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that we've talked about this before, is that conscious choice.
and that's
What are you going to do when you're faced with a positive or negative situation, or a challenging situation, be it positive or negative in undertone? What are you going to do? And I think that's the big question. What are you going to do to ensure that you're resilient?
yeah, and I was trying to get it out, but that's exactly where I was going to go. Is you still have that ability to make that choice, whatever that decision is. And again, some things are much larger than others, and may take more time, or maybe a little more difficult. But it still comes down to, you can choose,
Mm-hmm.
how you respond to it. And I'll bring it up again. You can be the victim or the victor.
Yeah,
And in some
absolutely.
cases, like I say, it is more difficult, and you can't
Mm-hmm.
just jump up and say, I'm going to be a victor. Sometimes it may take
Sometimes
a
it
little
takes
bit of,
time. It's a marathon, not
absolutely,
a race. So,
absolutely. So I think just making that conscious decision to make it a positive thing, and however you can do that, like I say, with our kids, when I would get laid off for months at a time, I couldn't go around, biting off their head and screaming and hollering at them, because, they had nothing to do with it. But
yeah,
what I could do, or what we could do, me and the wife, was help them, still have a good childhood, not,
yeah,
come in and dump all of our problems and say, hey, we can't do this, we can't do that. Just still, we made the decision to help them feel good and confident about the situation we were in. So they
mm-hmm.
never really knew, how many times the wife and I were pulling our hair out or
Right,
trying to
right.
figure things out. because that was a choice we made to not let them experience it or feel it to where it
Mhm.
affected them negatively at school or with their
Mhm.
friends or things like that. So they now that they're older, I know they can look back and say, wow, you deflected a lot of things from us or you helped us in a lot of ways that we weren't even aware of. Because now they're adults, they have
Yeah.
kids, they have those same concerns that they want to take care of their family. And again, being a good role model, both of us, for them, that's what we could do for them to help them be more resilient and see
Yeah.
that you can be resilient, see that
Mhm.
you can bounce back, see that things can be positive. So
Yeah.
that's how I think we help them.
Yeah, and I like that you brought in almost like a mini timeline of how it went from the children to the parents in that situation. And I think that's a perfect example because I wanted to just bring up briefly as we wrap things up is that, our podcast and these discussions about like resilience or any of our other topics, it's not just for our listeners that are in their advanced careers or they've got 15 years or 20 years of tenure. It could be for the person that's just starting out in their first 6 months or few months or first years of their career or just graduating high school. I mean, and now's kind of a weird time to be going into the job market. Talk about being resilient. I mean,
Right,
and do I go to college? Do I not go to college? Do I follow a trades path? Do I just go straight to work? I mean, what do I do? Where's and that's really what resilience is all about, are those choices right there. And I think that's an example of forced resilience because when we had those choices, when we were getting out of school, when we were first starting out, we had a lot of options and we were almost pre-programmed in a way to say, oh, well, you can do this or this. And now
right, right,
people that are entering the job market, regardless of their age, it's like it's a completely different environment. So when we talk
right,
about resilience, this is really like a prime example of being resilient. If you're trying to get into the job market or stay in the job market or find a new career or new path, be it in a personal relationship or even or professional, it's a very very tough time to be resilient, but you can do it.
right,
You can do it. So
right.
we've got a
Absolutely.
couple of minutes left. So what are your final thoughts there, Dr. Joe?
Well, like you kind of touched on a lot of the different things. Resilience, it's a common thing, but I think, like you said, that some of the things have changed to make people more resilient or give them that ability to be more resilient just
Mm-hmm.
because of the way things are today. I mean, just think about the kids and families that had to going through school, and then COVID
Mm-hmm.
hits, and then they
Yeah,
had to change how they
completely
did
change.
everything. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so having that ability to, bounce back, figure out the new plan or new plot, that's all part of it. And like you said, we probably faced a little bit more, maybe differently than we would
Mm-hmm.
have in the past, because
Fair statement.
like you said, coming out of high school for me was either join the military or get a job. That
Mm-hmm.
those were really my two options. I knew I couldn't afford to go to school, so but like you say, now today, the kids or young adults have so many options of what they want to do, or it's acceptable to say, "Hey, I'm going to do this or do that."
Right.
Where back then it was, "No, you do this or that." So
Yeah.
that resilience piece, it still comes down to that choice that you make to
Mm-hmm.
overcome it, to adapt, to figure it out. I mean, that's still a conscious choice you can make. And we do understand some situations are harder than others, and having that ability to bounce back or to, get in a positive state. But it is, you still can do it. You can
Yeah.
do it. All of us have that ability to do that. Like I said, in my case, having experienced it over and over again, not a pleasant thing, but we learned how to do it
Mm-hmm.
and make it work for us. So I think I'll leave it at that we all
Yeah.
have the ability to be resilient. And sometimes you have to flex that muscle more than, sometimes some people do it more than others, but we
Mm-hmm.
all have that ability to do it.
Well said, Dr. Joe. The only final thought I have is I would wager that if you're listening to this podcast or viewing it, everyone is resilient and has experienced
Right.
resilience. You just need to take a moment, pause, and self-reflect. So with that, We'd like to thank our viewers and listeners for tuning in for another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast. If you like us, like what you heard, think we're funny or not, whatever. If you enjoyed this episode, that's really where we're going with it. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please follow us, please share us. The more people we can that hear about us and what we have to offer, the more help we can provide. So until next time, keep on being your not so ordinary you.